At first, he does not take your silence seriously. That is the truth many people never talk about. In the beginning, he assumes this is just another emotional moment that will eventually pass. He believes you will come back the way you always did before. Another message, another reaction, another attempt to reconnect. Because when someone becomes used to your emotional availability, they stop imagining life without it permanently. He got comfortable knowing you cared deeply. No matter how distant he became, no matter how many times he disappointed you, part of him believed your feelings would always keep the connection alive. Your attention became predictable to him. Your forgiveness became expected. Your emotional reactions reassured him that no matter what happened, he still had access to your heart. That is why your silence does not immediately create panic. At first, it creates confidence. He tells himself you just need time. He assumes eventually you will miss him enough to break the silence first. Maybe he checks his phone casually, expecting your message to appear. Maybe he waits for the emotional conversation he believes will happen like every other time before. Because in his mind, your pattern has always been the same. You cared too much to truly disappear. But this time feels different. Days begin passing without emotional reactions from you. No long paragraphs explaining your pain. No attempts to force communication. No chasing. No emotional chaos. Just silence. Calm, consistent silence. And slowly something uncomfortable starts happening inside him. He begins noticing the absence. At first it is subtle. He notices you are no longer watching his every move. No more immediate replies. No more emotional energy constantly surrounding him. The attention he became comfortable receiving is suddenly gone. And while he may still act unaffected outwardly, internally he starts questioning why your silence feels heavier this time. Because consistency changes everything. Temporary silence does not scare people, but consistent silence forces reality to settle in. The longer you remain emotionally unavailable, the more he begins realizing this may not be another temporary phase. And that realization slowly shifts his confidence into uncertainty. Now he starts wondering whether something inside you truly changed. See, people often underestimate your absence while they still believe they have emotional access to you. As long as they think you are still attached enough to return eventually, they remain emotionally comfortable. But when your silence becomes steady, calm, and detached, it creates a feeling they cannot easily ignore. For the first time, he may begin sensing what life feels like without your constant emotional presence. The reassurance you gave him, the support, the attention, the emotional safety of knowing someone cared deeply no matter how he behaved. Those things become noticeable only after they disappear. And what makes your silence powerful is that it removes predictability. He no longer knows what you feel, no longer knows whether you still miss him, no longer knows whether he still matters in your life the same way. That uncertainty slowly starts replacing the emotional control he once felt secure having over the situation. Meanwhile, you are no longer exhausting yourself trying to explain your worth. You are no longer fighting to be understood by someone who became too comfortable with your presence. And that emotional withdrawal becomes the first moment he begins realizing. Your silence may not be temporary after all, because sometimes people only start paying attention when the person they took for granted stops reacting completely. And the moment your silence becomes consistent is the moment he starts realizing he may actually lose you for real. As the days pass, your silence begins changing something inside him. What once felt normal in his life suddenly feels missing, and he cannot fully escape the emptiness your absence creates. At first, he thought he could easily adjust. He assumed life would continue the same way even without hearing from you constantly. But slowly, reality begins settling in. The emotional energy you brought into his life was far more valuable than he realized while he still had access to it. Because people often notice comfort most after it disappears. He starts feeling absence in small moments first. The good morning messages that no longer arrive, the emotional support that once felt automatic, the attention, reassurance, understanding and care that quietly became part of his daily life. Those things used to surround him so naturally that he stopped appreciating them. But now the silence has created space, and inside that space, he finally begins noticing what your presence was truly worth. That emotional void grows quietly. At random moments during the day, he thinks about reaching out. He wonders what you are doing. Whether you still think about him, whether your silence means anger, healing, or emotional detachment. And what unsettles him most is that he no longer feels emotionally connected to you the same way he once did. The access he took for granted has disappeared. See, while you were constantly available, emotionally he felt secure. Secure knowing someone cared deeply. Secure knowing your loyalty remained even after disappointment. Secure knowing your attention was always there when he wanted it. But your silence removes that emotional comfort completely. And for the first time, he is left facing the reality of your absence instead of depending on your presence. The hardest thing for him to accept is that your energy-filled emotional spaces he never even acknowledged properly. Your support gave stability. Your attention gave reassurance. Your care softened difficult days. Your consistency created emotional peace. And now that those things are gone, life feels emotionally colder in ways he cannot ignore. At first, pride may stop him from admitting it. He may distract himself temporarily, surround himself with noise, or pretend your silence does not affect him deeply. But silence has a powerful way of exposing emotional dependency over time, because eventually distractions fade and reality remains. Now he starts replaying memories unexpectedly. He notices the emotional warmth that disappeared from his routine. He realizes how rare genuine loyalty actually is. And what hurts him most is understanding too late that not everyone gives love, patience, and emotional support the way you did. This is where regret quietly begins growing, not because you are begging him to notice your worth, but because your absence forces him to feel it naturally. The emotional void you left behind becomes impossible to replace easily. And the more consistent your silence becomes, the more noticeable that emptiness feels. Meanwhile, something else is happening. You are slowly reclaiming your own energy. The attention that once revolved around him is returning to your own life. Your peace is no longer dependent on whether he acknowledges your value. And while he is beginning to feel the emotional loss, you are beginning to heal from the emotional exhaustion of overgiving. That shift changes everything. Because once someone truly feels your absence emotionally, they start understanding the difference between temporary attention and genuine connection. They begin realizing how deeply your presence affected their life after the comfort disappears completely. And sometimes the silence hurts them most because it finally forces them to experience life without the emotional peace your love once quietly provided every single day. The longer your silence continues, the louder his thoughts become. At first, distractions may have protected him from fully feeling the loss. Pride may have convinced him everything was fine. But silence removes distraction little by little, and eventually he is left alone with his own mind. No emotional reactions from you. No arguments to shift the blame. No conversations distracting him from what really happened. Memories. And memories become heavy when someone valuable is no longer there. That is when he starts replaying everything. Conversations he once ignored suddenly return to his mind with painful clarity. He remembers the moments you tried explaining your feelings while he dismissed them. The times you stayed patient even when you were hurt. The effort you gave without receiving the same energy back. And slowly he begins seeing situations differently than he did before. Because silence creates reflection. When you were still emotionally reacting, it was easier for him to avoid accountability. Arguments created noise. Emotional tension created distractions. But now your silence forces him to sit with the truth quietly. He starts recognizing the things he overlooked while he still had easy access to your love. He remembers your loyalty, the way you stayed through moments when most people would have walked away, the way you tried to hold the relationship together even when it exhausted you emotionally. The way you gave reassurance, understanding, patience, and emotional support without constantly demanding recognition for it. Those memories begin following him because genuine care becomes much more visible once it disappears. And regret always arrives late. That is the painful reality. Many people do not fully appreciate consistency, while they have it because comfort makes them careless. They assume your love will continue no matter how little effort they give back. But once silence replaces your emotional presence, they finally begin understanding how much they were receiving without valuing it properly. Now he starts questioning his own actions. Why did he ignore your feelings? Why did he become distant when you were trying to love him genuinely? Why did he wait until your silence to realize your worth? Those questions begin growing inside him because your absence creates emotional space for reflection in a way constant communication never could. And memories become even heavier because there is no easy way to fix them anymore. See, when someone still reacts emotionally, there is always hope that the connection remains open. But your silence feels different. It feels calm, detached, final. And that uncertainty makes the regret even deeper because now he is no longer sure whether he still has access to your heart the way he once did. He begins replaying small moments too. The little things he overlooked, your kindness, your effort, the emotional safety you brought into his life, the way you cared even when you were emotionally drained yourself. And the painful part for him is realizing how rare that kind of loyalty actually was. Sometimes guilt becomes louder late at night when distractions disappear. Sometimes memories hit unexpectedly during ordinary moments. And slowly he starts understanding that losing someone who genuinely cared creates a different kind of emptiness. Meanwhile, your silence protects your peace. You are no longer exhausting yourself, trying to force accountability from someone who failed to see your value in real time. And because you stopped chasing understanding, he is finally forced to confront understanding on his own. That is the power of silence. It removes the noise and leaves people alone with the consequences of their choices. And sometimes the deepest regret comes from realizing too late that the person you took for granted was the person who loved you most sincerely. As your silence continues, something begins changing inside his mind that he did not expect in the beginning. Uncertainty. At first, he believed he still understood your emotions. He assumed you were hurt, emotional, and eventually going to return the way you always had before. But the longer you remain silent, calm, and emotionally distant, the more he begins realizing he no longer knows where he stands in your life. And that loss of certainty starts affecting him deeply. Because when someone becomes used to having emotional access to you, they feel secure even during conflict. He was comfortable knowing you still cared enough to react. Your attention, your effort, your emotional attachment reassured him that no matter what happened, he still mattered to you. But now your silence removes that reassurance completely. Suddenly, questions begin filling his mind. Did you finally move on? Are you happier without him? Is someone else now receiving the love and attention he once had access to? Do you still miss him at all, or have you emotionally detached completely? And the painful part for him is that he no longer has answers. That uncertainty becomes heavy because silence creates mystery. When you stop constantly expressing your emotions, people can no longer measure their importance in your life the same way. He cannot tell whether you still care deeply or whether you are finally letting go emotionally. And because human beings naturally fear losing what once felt secure, your emotional distance starts creating anxiety inside him. He begins checking for signs. Maybe he looks at your social media more often now. Maybe he replays old conversations trying to understand whether your silence means finality. Maybe he starts paying attention to things he ignored before because now he feels the possibility of truly losing you becoming real. And what unsettles him most is seeing that life continues moving without his emotional presence controlling your world anymore. You are no longer chasing communication, no longer forcing emotional closeness, no longer trying to prove your value repeatedly. Instead, your silence suggests something he never prepared for. You may actually be learning how to live without him emotionally. That realization creates fear, because people often take emotional access for granted until it disappears. As long as they believe you are still emotionally waiting for them, they remain comfortable. But once your energy becomes unavailable, once your silence becomes consistent, they start understanding how fragile emotional connection really is. He starts imagining scenarios he never worried about before. What if you finally realized your worth? What if someone else is treating you better? What if the version of you that loved him unconditionally no longer exists the same way? Those thoughts begin growing because uncertainty forces people to confront possibilities they once ignored confidently. And ironically, your silence says more than emotional reactions ever could, because emotional reactions reassure people that they still affect you deeply. But silence leaves room for doubt. Silence creates emotional distance that cannot easily be measured or controlled. And for someone who once felt secure having unlimited emotional access to you, that loss of certainty becomes emotionally unsettling. Meanwhile, while he is consumed by uncertainty, you are slowly reclaiming your peace. Your focus is no longer centered around proving your love or waiting for validation. You are learning how to exist beyond the emotional dependency that once kept you attached. And that calmness becomes intimidating because it signals emotional growth. Now he is the one wondering, the one questioning, the one feeling emotionally unsettled by the silence he never thought would last this long. Because sometimes people only realize your value after they no longer feel guaranteed access to your heart. And the moment uncertainty replaces emotional control is the moment your silence starts haunting them deeply. At some point, your silence stops looking like pain and starts looking like growth. And that is the moment it begins affecting him differently. In the beginning, he may have expected heartbreak to weaken you. He thought your silence came from sadness, disappointment, or emotional exhaustion. He assumed eventually you would break, reach out, or return emotionally the way you always had before. But instead of falling apart, you started changing quickly, powerfully. And now your growth begins intimidating him. Because while he expected your world to stop moving without him, you started rebuilding yourself. You became calmer, more focused, more emotionally disciplined. The energy that once went into chasing answers, seeking validation, or holding on to emotional confusion slowly turned inward. You began investing in yourself instead. That transformation becomes impossible for him to ignore over time. He notices the difference in your energy first. You no longer seem emotionally desperate for attention. Your silence feels peaceful now, not wounded. You carry yourself differently when your happiness no longer depends on someone choosing you. There is confidence in your distance, strength in your boundaries, calmness in your absence, and that calmness unsettles him because it signals something dangerous. You are learning how to live happily without him. See, people are often comfortable when they believe they still emotionally control your attention. But when they see you growing beyond the pain they caused, uncertainty turns into regret. Because now he starts realizing your silence was not weakness, it was transformation. You begin improving your life mentally, emotionally, physically, spiritually, maybe even financially. You stop obsessing over what he is doing and start focusing on your own peace, your own future, your own purpose. And while he expected heartbreak to keep you emotionally attached, your growth slowly removes the emotional dependency that once gave him comfort. That is what intimidates him most. The version of you he once knew is disappearing. The person who tolerated inconsistency, over-explained their feelings, or chased emotional reassurance is slowly being replaced by someone stronger, someone more aware of their worth, someone less willing to sacrifice their peace for temporary attention. And suddenly he begins seeing your value differently. Not because you begged him to notice it, but because your growth naturally exposes what he underestimated. Your confidence becomes louder than any emotional reaction ever could. Your discipline becomes more powerful than anger. Your silence combined with self-improvement creates a presence that feels out of reach now. Meanwhile, he may still be emotionally stuck in old patterns while you continue evolving. And that contrast creates regret because people often realize the value of someone's only after watching them become everything they failed to appreciate properly. He expected pain to destroy your confidence. Instead, pain built your strength. He expected silence to keep you emotionally waiting. Instead, silence helped you emotionally detach. He expected your world to revolve around him. Instead, he watches you becoming more connected to yourself than ever before. And the painful realization slowly starts hitting him. The stronger you become, the less likely you are to ever tolerate the same treatment again. That is why your growth becomes intimidating. Because growth changes your standards. It changes your energy. It changes what you are willing to accept emotionally. And once someone realizes you no longer need them the way you once did, they begin understanding how much they truly lost. Because nothing creates deeper regret than watching someone you underestimated become stronger, happier, and emotionally unreachable without you. By the time he fully understands what your silence meant, it is usually already too late. That is the part people rarely realize in the beginning. Silence is not always a game. Sometimes silence is what happens when someone finally becomes emotionally exhausted. When they stop fighting for understanding, stop begging for consistency, stop trying to hold together something that kept hurting them more than healing them. At first, he thought your silence was temporary. Then he thought it was emotional pain. Then he thought maybe you were trying to prove a point. But as time passes, he slowly begins realizing something much heavier. Your silence was not about punishing him. It was about freeing yourself emotionally. And that realization hits deeply, because now he sees the difference in you. You are no longer emotionally waiting around, no longer reacting to every little thing he does, no longer chasing conversations that drain your peace. The emotional attachment he once relied on has faded. And for the first time, he understands what true emotional detachment looks like. It is quiet, not angry, not dramatic. Just calm, and calmness after heartbreak is powerful because it signals healing. It shows that you are no longer emotionally trapped in the cycle that once controlled your happiness. You finally reached the point where protecting your peace became more important than protecting the connection. That is when regret becomes real for him. Because people often believe they have more time than they actually do. They assume loyal hearts will continue waiting forever. They mistake patience for permanence. But eventually, every emotionally exhausted person reaches a breaking point where they stop explaining themselves and simply let go silently. Now he starts recognizing everything too late. The loyalty you gave, the consistency, the emotional safety, the way you tried to communicate instead of giving up immediately, the way you stayed even while hurting. Those things become painfully visible only after your emotional presence disappears completely. And what hurts him most is realizing you are no longer the same person emotionally. The version of you that once chased understanding, overextended yourself, and tolerated emotional inconsistency no longer exists the same way. Your silence changed you. The pain forced you to grow stronger boundaries, stronger self-respect, and stronger emotional discipline. And because of that growth, he can feel that access to your heart is no longer guaranteed. That loss creates a kind of regret that stays in people for a long time, not because you became cruel or bitter, but because you became unavailable to the treatment you once tolerated. Your silence became the final proof that you were done sacrificing yourself emotionally for someone to fail to value your love properly. Meanwhile, you are no longer focused on whether he regrets losing you. That is the true sign of healing. Your happiness no longer depends on his realization. You stopped waiting for apologies, explanations, or emotional closure from someone who repeatedly created confusion. Instead, you found closure within yourself. And that is where your real power begins. You move differently now. You protect your peace differently. You stop giving unlimited emotional access to people who only appreciate your value after your absence becomes permanent. And because of that, you become emotionally untouchable in a way that silence alone could never achieve before growth. Sometimes people only realize your worth after they lose the version of you that loved them without limits. But by then, you are no longer emotionally standing in the same place waiting for them to finally understand. And sometimes the most powerful ending is becoming so healed that their regret no longer has the power to interrupt your peace.